One of my friends this week on Facebook, another pastor actually said, well, what words could we say this day? And I said, to be honest, like probably many of us feel, we've settled them all already. And so perhaps in my own desperation or own despair, I didn't think that there were any more words to say. Reading what Valerie Power says gave me some ideas to share with you today. This scripture, this gospel, is the last section of Jesus's reflection, or at least in the mind of John, the gospel writer, his reflection on what now we are to do. Pat shared with the children that Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And in a way, through Christian tradition, we believe that we become the embodiment of Jesus in the world. So John's reflection said today in the form of a prayer, which is interesting. It's not, Jesus is praying for us. Jesus isn't praying for himself, but praying for himself. Praying for us, I'm sorry. And the prayer is directed to the Father. Now, this was another writer, but here there's lots of translations and interpretation of that word. But the sense of this is, if you take it back to the Hebrew, that would have been in the original Hebrew, not the Greek necessarily. But the word in Hebrew is Abba. Or for us, the translation might be more like daddy. So that it's not a formal address, but more of a familiar, a family address, but more than that. This other writer suggests that the prayer is addressed to the one who is the source of life, or is a source of life, let's put it that way. So that the prayer is an invitation to join with the source of life that is in existence, whether that's God or whatever it might be, that becomes life-giving, nourishing, enables to flourish and prosper, if you will, that it has to do with that. Not necessarily to the level of a parent, but yes, in that sense. So the invitation of Jesus to reflect on his prayer is to join with the source of life. And so here's what Valerie says. She says one thing that we can do right now is to reimagine. And she writes, what is the world that we want? What is the world that we want? What does the beloved community really look like? What does it feel like? We can only live into what we imagine. We can't live if there's no imagining. I told the story a while back about the neighbor, the little boy, the little Jewish boy next door who was always filled with questions. And I told his parents later, I said, don't ever shut the questions down, because it was his way of trying to imagine more, so that we ask the questions. That's what Chalice says it is, right? The questions are as important as any answers, if not more important in many ways. Because it's asking us to think outside of our minds, our boxes, and to imagine. So what is the church that we want to be? What is the church that we imagine in the world? But more than that, what is the community that we imagine? Protect time and space to dream, and dream big. Then take the one step towards that dream. So one of the things in Jesus's prayer, it's interesting that if we are to have contact with the source of life, then the second thing that he asks in the prayer is that we be one. And again, there's many levels of understanding this, but here, the idea of oneness, well, it's not ever the idea of sameness. Perhaps that's why I've always struggled all of the years of being involved with church, of thinking about joining the United Church of Christ, and there go, that all may be one, and that's kind of what this is about. And thinking in terms of humanism, like, well, let's heal all the divisions in the churches and get back to being one. And from an old Roman Catholic point of view, usually that meant you got to become like us more than anything. So that oneness had to do with you got to join us and become like us. And so I always resisted that idea and rejected it and railed against it in some instances. But what this other writer describes is that oneness in the context of thinking about being joined to the source of life, that oneness here has to do with the hope of Jesus, that we'll never forget that we actually are the same. Meaning, oneness is that we recognize that as human beings, we are human beings together. And that only in recognizing that we're human beings together can there be a sense of the oneness of this. You know, we live right now in a time of such great division of all sorts, right? The divisiveness of the rhetoric of our lives and the world in which we live separates and divides and makes the distinctions that are unique to each individual be the source of fear or anxiety or hate, whatever it might be. So that oneness has to do that we are human beings together. And so a restoration of what it means to be human beings together is very, very important. We share this likeness in the source of life so that oneness comes from kinship with the one, with God, if you will, with the divine. And so there has to be a way to, again, recognize that we are together rather than separated. Through the 2 years or more of the pandemic and the isolation that we feel, I think that's what part of the challenge has been, right? We forgot that. Valerie says that, you know, maybe it's because that we've forgotten this that leads us to experience such terrible acts of violence against others, that other is not understood to be one with us. So that it's easy to kill and to murder and to destroy life because it's outside, different from us. And so it doesn't matter what we do towards others because we don't see the other as us, as one of us. And so the movement has to be in this prayer of, you know, you're one people. Yes, with all of the diversity that comes in being human beings, but you're still one. Every soldier firing a gun in the Ukraine is one. Every person trying to come across the border without proper documentation and papers is one. Every child in that classroom was one with us. So that maybe that's why it hurts so much, is because some of us died, parts of us died in that classroom. It dies every time that there's a mass murder, mass killing. The suggestion is that if we could come back to understanding how we are one, then that might be a part of what can change. And this other writer says that the second thing is that Jesus is commenting on, you know, so that they may believe. And here belief hasn't to do with memorizing or accepting dogmas or doctrines or creeds. She writes, when human beings forget that we belong to one another, we cannot love, we cannot live without fear and violence. To believe means to trust, to hold dear, to give our hearts to. That's what Jesus hopes for, that the whole world would trust in our shared oneness with the one. He knows that the alternative is brokenness, is hate that turns into violence. So to believe means that we really do believe. It's hard these days to believe that, but that we really believe that we're one. And the second thing, the last thing in this thing is that Jesus refers to the Father sending him. And in the story of the ascension, at the end of Matthew's gospel, as Jesus departs, perhaps again in Matthew's words, Jesus says to those gathered on the top of the Mount of Olives that day, now I send you into the world to be and to do something so fantastic that it will indeed heal and make whole what has been broken. And Valerie Knorr says, I thought this was so important. She says, we need to build a beloved community where we are. We need to build a beloved, and this is what I thought was so powerful. She says, we need a shift in culture and consciousness, block by block, heart by heart. I believe we can make every school, every house, every workplace, every community a place where we leave no one outside our circle of care, where we help one another be brave and whole, where we can become the medicine that stops the violence at its root. We can do this by putting love into practice. That's so hard, isn't it, perhaps? Diana Butler-Bass, who I've been mentioning, she says finally this: oneness would have saved those little ones. Oneness would have protected innocent churchgoers from abuse. Oneness would have prevented the beautiful souls in Buffalo from a cruel death. Oneness would have overcome so very much. May we be one, if only we knew that we are all one. That is the truth of things, if only we remembered before the next horror. We only trusted oneness, gave our hearts to it, lived it. Jesus didn't pray about us, he prayed for us. We can pray with him, and we can be the answer to the prayer. Love would surely result.